In the stillness of a Pretoria night, a boy sat cross-legged on the thin carpet of his bedroom floor, a hum of silence broken only by the restless scratching of a pencil across worn paper. He was 12, maybe 13, and in his hands he carried an odd inheritance ideas too heavy for his age, dreams that seemed ridiculous within the walls of that modest house. The neighborhood was quiet, though it carried an unspoken heaviness, a quiet that felt like resignation, as if everyone had long ago agreed to live within the boundaries set for them. But Elon never agreed. He scribbled furiously, writing equations, half-formed codes, little sketches of rockets and computers he had only seen in magazines. To him, the pages felt like fragments of another world trying to break through, though no one around him seemed to care. To his classmates, he was strange. To his parents, he was restless. To himself, he was lost somewhere between ridicule and obsession. At school, Elon found no sanctuary. The playground was not a place for dreamers. It was a battleground, and he was the boy always outnumbered. The bullies didn't just shove him into corners. They followed him, waited for him, dragged him down staircases until his body hit the floor with a violence that bruised more than skin. He remembers one day most vividly, lying at the bottom of the stairs, breathless, a ringing in his ears, and thinking not of the pain, not of the humiliation, but of how utterly meaningless it all seemed. He felt like a character misplaced in the wrong script, a misprint in someone else's story. The adults would say he was too sensitive, too withdrawn, too caught up in fantasy. But the truth was simpler. Elon was already building an escape hatch in his mind. Evenings at home carried their own kind of silence, though it wasn't peaceful. His father's presence lingered like a shadow too large to ignore, critical, sharp, filled with disapproval. Affection was rationed in that household. Warmth was replaced with cold expectation. Elon learned early that survival required invisibility, that silence was safer than defiance. Yet in that silence, he found his only ally, books. He read with a hunger that alarmed even himself. Science fiction, philosophy, engineering manuals, anything that hinted at worlds beyond South Africa's borders. He devoured stories not because they entertained him, but because they whispered a truth he couldn't yet prove, that life didn't have to stay this way. It was during one of those nights, hunched over a second-hand computer, that Elon took his first real step. He was barely a teenager when he coded his own video game symbol by today's standards. Primitive even, but to him, it was a rebellion disguised as pixels. A spaceship dodging obstacles, surviving in a hostile universe. He sold it for a few $100s, a meaningless amount to most, but to him, it was proof. Proof that something inside him could translate into value, proof that imagination could break into reality. He didn't know it then, but that tiny sale would etch itself into his memory, not as a triumph, but as a question. If one small idea could earn him money, what else could be built from this chaos? Still, the world outside didn't applaud. No one cared about the boy who coded a game. No one praised him for filling his notebooks with impossible equations. When he spoke of space travel or colonizing other planets, the laughter was merciless. It wasn't the laughter of amusement. It was the laughter of dismissal, the kind that strips you down until you doubt your own voice. There is a peculiar cruelty in being mocked not for who you are, but for daring to imagine something larger. Elon carried that cruelty like a scar that never quite healed. By the time he was 17, the weight of Pretoria became unbearable. He knew if he stayed, the walls would close in until even his ideas suffocated. South Africa was his birthplace, but it was never his home. It was a cage. He could already sense that his survival depended on distance. Leaving meant betrayal to some, but to him, it meant oxygen. He chose Canada not because it promised wealth, but because it promised escape, a chance to breathe outside the chokehold of familiarity. But freedom never comes without a price. In Canada, Ilan found himself surrounded not by opportunity, but by absence. He had no money, no safety net, no comforting voices to remind him he was right to leave. Instead, he had a stack of rejection letters and a string of part-time jobs that broke his body while mocking his mind. He shoveled dirt on farms, cleaned boilers in student housing, worked shifts that left his hands blistered and his spirit brittle. In those moments, it wasn't ambition that kept him moving. It was stubbornness, a refusal to be swallowed by obscurity. He would come home exhausted, collapse on thin mattresses in cramped rooms, and stare at ceilings that seemed lower with each passing night. And yet, even then, he would take out his notebooks, scrawl new equations, sketch designs of technologies that didn't exist. Failure became a constant companion. He would apply for opportunities, and doors would close before they even opened. He would present ideas, and eyes would glaze over, uninterested. He was too poor to belong to the elite, too strange to belong to the ordinary. This in-between existence gnawed at him. The humiliation of anonymity pressed down heavier than the fists of childhood bullies. At least back then, someone noticed him enough to inflict pain. Now he was invisible, a ghost drifting between borrowed rooms and borrowed time. The turning point wasn't a grand revelation. It was a small, almost pathetic decision. To study relentlessly, to use education as a ladder, no matter how splintered it was. In lecture halls, he found fragments of belonging, though even there, he felt like an outsider peering through the glass. He wasn't the loudest in the room, nor the most admired. He was the boy who sat alone, taking notes with an intensity that frightened others. He studied economics and physics, not for the sake of diplomas, but because he believed desperately that they were the languages of escape. Yet, ambition has a cruel way of outgrowing its environment. Ilan realized quickly that Canada was too small for the visions scratching at the back of his skull. If he wanted to chase them, he had to move again. This time to the United States. He would arrive with little more than student debt and a fragile certainty that he couldn't explain even to himself. The first years in America were anything but glamorous. He shared rooms with strangers, skipped meals, and lived perpetually on the edge of exhaustion. The future he dreamed of seemed laughably distant. But there was something inside him, a voice that refused to quiet even when logic insisted otherwise. It told him to keep going, to risk humiliation again and again, to knock on doors that slammed shut, to pitch ideas that earned smirks instead of interest. He remembers one evening in particular. He had been coding for hours in a dim apartment that smelled faintly of mildew, his body shaking from caffeine and lack of food. His bank account was nearly empty, his stomach hollow, and his thoughts dark. He asked himself a question he would return to countless times. Was this worth it? Was he building a future, or just prolonging a delusion? He leaned back in his chair, stared at the cracked ceiling, and felt the weight of insignificance pressing down. If he quit now, no one would notice, no one would care. He would dissolve back into the crowd, another immigrant who tried and failed. But then, like the spaceship in his childhood game, he imagined dodging the obstacles, surviving just long enough to see what lay ahead. It wasn't optimism that drove him. It was defiance. He would rather collapse under the weight of failure than live suffocated by safety. That was the night he resolved to take his first true step into the abyss of entrepreneurship. Not in the safety of theory, not in the quiet of his notebooks, but in reality. He would gamble the little he had on an idea that the internet, still young and chaotic, could be shaped into something far larger than anyone imagined. He didn't know the shape yet, didn't know the cost, but he knew the feeling, a sense that he was standing at the edge of something immense. And so began his descent into risk, armed with nothing but borrowed computers, sleepless nights, and a hunger that bordered on desperation. His first ventures weren't majestic. They were fragile, stumbling creations that barely held together. Zip2 was nothing more than a directory service, a digital map for businesses. But for Ilan, it was oxygen. He worked through nights, slept under his desk, showered at the YMCA, and lived on caffeine and scraps. He wasn't just building software. He was clawing his way out of invisibility. Each line of code felt like defiance. Each small contract signed like a breath, stolen from suffocation. Still, rejection was everywhere. Investors laughed at his awkward pitches. Partners dismissed his intensity as madness, and his own exhaustion betrayed him. There were nights he cried quietly into the stale air of his office, the loneliness pressing down like gravity. To fail was humiliating, but to fail alone was devastating. Yet, through it all, he kept going. Because behind every humiliation was that lingering, poisonous question, what if I gave up now? It was in that fragile state, half broken, half determined, that he experienced his first small victory. A modest contract signed, a reluctant investor finally agreeing, a business directory sold for a sum that wouldn't change the world, but changed his. It was the first time someone outside his own head confirmed that he wasn't insane. The world, at last, acknowledged him not with applause, not with admiration, but with a transaction. To anyone else, it was trivial. To Ilan, it was everything. That first step tasted of both triumph and dread. Triumph, because it proved he could bend reality to his will. Dread, because he understood now how endless and merciless the path would be. He realized the cruel truth. Beginnings are not grand. They are humiliating, lonely, fragile things. They demand everything and give almost nothing in return. But without them, there is no story, no ascent, no chance at survival. The fragile victory of Zip2 was supposed to feel like relief. Instead, it felt like standing on a ledge, staring at the abyss, knowing the ground beneath him could crumble at any moment. Ilan understood something most people never want to admit. Success does not silence doubt, it amplifies it. For every small contract signed, there were whispers of dismissal, murmurs that his company was nothing more than a child's experiment. Investors questioned his competence, partners mocked his awkwardness, and even those closest to him doubted whether he could lead. He was not yet a CEO. He was a boy still trying to convince the world he belonged at the table. The days blurred together. He coded until his fingers ached, negotiated until his voice cracked, and slept under his desk until exhaustion erased the line between night and morning. There was no glamour in those beginnings, only the bitter taste of survival. His office was not an empire. It was a cramped room where stale air carried the smell of old coffee and sweat. He would wake to the hum of fluorescent lights, his body curled on the floor, his dreams interrupted by the sound of machines he could barely afford to run. The humiliations never ended. He remembers walking into boardrooms with his best suit, cheap, ill-fitting, borrowed, and watching men twice his age smirk as he stumbled over his words. They didn't see a visionary. They saw an immigrant boy too young, too awkward, too desperate. Deals collapsed before they began. Investors dismissed him mid-sentence, and colleagues whispered that he was unfit to lead. His own company, the fragile thing he had poured his life into, was nearly taken from him when investors pushed him aside. To them, he was expendable, a placeholder until someone more polished arrived. The rejection burned deeper than all the playground fists of his childhood. It wasn't just his body being beaten now, it was his worth. But humiliation has a way of sharpening defiance. Each dismissal only confirmed his suspicion that if he wanted to build something extraordinary, he would have to endure pain that most people would run from. He told himself that pain was the tax of ambition. He accepted loneliness as his only companion, sleepless nights as his natural state. He was learning the cruel truth of the first step, that no one believes in you, not until you've already bled enough to prove them wrong. Zip, too, eventually stumbled into legitimacy, not because the world suddenly believed in Elon, but because he refused to let it collapse. When the company was sold, the payout was larger than anything he had ever touched before. To others, it was freedom. To him, it was fuel. The money didn't silence the voices of doubt. It only gave him a louder stage on which to confront them. With that fragile foundation, he plunged headfirst into his next risk. X. Com, a digital banking experiment that would evolve into PayPal. The idea was radical for its time, too radical, perhaps. Once again, he faced ridicule. Bankers dismissed him as reckless, rivals called him naive, and even his team sometimes questioned his judgment. But Elon had already learned that ridicule was the soundtrack of beginnings. He built anyway. He coded, pitched, begged for attention, earned through his savings, and endured boardroom wars that nearly destroyed him. Once again, investors pushed him aside, labeling him unfit to lead. Once again, he found himself on the outside of the very company he had birthed. But here lies the paradox of those early steps. Rejection and survival often walk hand in hand. PayPal did not crumble, even when Elon was pushed aside. It thrived. And when it was finally sold, Elon was left not with humiliation, but with a fortune enough to secure a comfortable life forever. But comfort was never his ambition. Comfort was a slow death. He knew this money was not an end, but a beginning, a tool to open the doors that mocked him before. Yet victory is always bitter in the beginning. The press called him eccentric, unstable. Colleagues called him impossible. Investors called him reckless. The more he tried to build, the more the world pushed back. But Elon understood now what he had only felt as a boy, lying at the bottom of a staircase. Survival is not about strength. It is about refusing to stop moving. He turned his eyes upward literally. Space, rockets, colonies on Mars. To most, it sounded absurd, the fantasies of a man who had finally lost touch with reality. But Elon knew absurdity well. Absurdity was where all beginnings lived. He founded SpaceX not as a polished CEO with guaranteed success, but as a man ready to gamble everything, even his dignity. He poured nearly all his PayPal fortune into it, risking not just bankruptcy, but public humiliation on a global scale. The first launches failed. Rockets exploded. Millions of dollars turned to fire and smoke in seconds. The world laughed. The headlines were merciless. The same whispers returned. He's reckless, he's unstable, he's done. Each failure tore pieces of him away, not just financially, but emotionally. He stood at the edge of ruin, knowing one more failure would end not only SpaceX, but his dream of proving that humanity could stretch beyond its fragile home. And yet, in the silence after each explosion, Elon returned to the same thought that haunted him since childhood. What if I gave up now? He imagined himself walking away, living quietly with what money he had left. He imagined the relief of no longer being mocked, no longer being doubted, no longer carrying the weight of impossible expectations. But the thought sickened him, because to give up would be to betray the boy who scribbled rockets in worn notebooks, the boy who coded spaceships into crude video games, the boy who lay at the bottom of the stairs and dreamed of escape. So he risked everything again. He scraped together the last of his fortune, convinced investors to hold their faith for one more launch. It was a gamble so reckless that even he questioned his sanity. Failure would mean ruin. Success would mean survival. Nothing in between. The rocket launched. This time, it did not explode. This time, it pierced the sky, carrying with it not just machinery, but the weight of every humiliation, every failure, every sleepless night, every moment of being invisible and dismissed. For the first time, the world stopped laughing. For the first time, they looked at him not as a boy out of place, but as a man who had defied gravity itself. That fragile victory, like the sale of his childhood video game, was not an end. It was a reminder that beginnings are not grand, they are brutal. They are lonely. They demand pain, ridicule, humiliation, and sacrifice. They strip you of comfort, test your sanity, and leave you scarred. And yet, they are the only path forward. When Elon reflects on those early years, he does not remember them as triumphs. He remembers the bruises, the rejections, the nights he cried quietly in empty rooms. He remembers the taste of failure more vividly than the taste of success. He remembers the haunting silence of being invisible, the cruelty of being dismissed. But he also remembers the fragile, intoxicating power of the first step, the moment he proved, if only to himself, that dreams, however absurd, could be dragged into reality. The lesson is not comforting. It is not the story of a man who was destined for greatness, nor the tale of a genius who easily conquered. It is the story of a boy who bled quietly in the shadows, who risked humiliation again and again, who survived not because the world believed in him, but because he refused to surrender to its disbelief. And if you strip away the billions, the headlines, the myths, what remains is something raw and human. A reminder that the first step is always the hardest, the loneliest, and the most essential. It demands that you walk blind into ridicule, that you endure failure with no promise of reward, that you risk becoming nothing more than a ghost in history. Elon Musk took that step. And for all his scars, for all his flaws, for all the nights of despair that will never make it into polished biographies, he never stopped moving forward. Because in the end, the truth is simple, brutal, and eternal. Greatness is not built in moments of applause. It is built in the silence of humiliation, in the darkness of failure, in the endless, suffocating weight of beginnings. And the only question that matters, the question Elon carried with him since childhood, the question every dreamer must face, is this: what if you gave up now?